more, something further about the mysticism of Hazrat Inayat Khan. Now, Hazrat Inayat Khan's Sufism is by definition, of course, mysticism, and it really pervades all his work, his visionary intuition, everything which is really, and is inspired by precisely that mystical vision, experience of his, or else it is indeed pervaded by that evocative force which mysticism gives to his teachings. But at the same time, of course, one can, if one tries to approach that more analytically, one can distinguish all different ways. Now, as I said, Hazrat Inayat Khan's life's work is a veritable treasure house of values which one can approach in very different ways, of which each of us can take that out of it, which appeals to one, which makes sense for oneself. But at the same time, for this occasion here, I've chosen to make this distinction in Hazrat Inayat Khan's Sufi mysticism between the esoteric aspect and the metaphysical aspect. Now, the esoteric aspect means the individual development of a person who has decided to take up on widowhood and to have this path of training and ultimate realization, and the other, and so to speak, the microcosmic aspect, whereas, of course, the metaphysical is the cosmological aspect, is the macrocosmic aspect. I hope to deal with that tomorrow. And but still, I would, because let me, if you agree to begin with, later we'll discuss the Wazifa and everything to do with that. But let me at this moment briefly resume, if you agree, those things which I said yesterday about the esoteric approach. That means the different ways in which those who have been initiated in Sufism will proceed with further inner development and expansion. Now, I think one might say there are three different aspects to this, and just to call them the disciplinary, the ethical, and the aesthetic ways of approaching Sufism. Yeah?
Can you speak a little bit slower?
I'll try my best. I'll try. Thank you, yes. Oh, that is okay, very good. We have plenty of time anyway. So, I said there are three different aspects, as far as I could see, in this esoteric approach. And the first one, all of you are familiar with, I think. The first one is the practices which you are given. Practices which in part pertain to the breath, the training of the breath, the so-called purification breath, which are very generally done and which must be familiar to many of you. And then there is the series of 7 consecutive practices, the different stages of practice. And these are, as you probably all know, the technical terms for those are the namaz, the wazifa, the zikr, the fikr, and those really, as I said yesterday, really comprise, in a sense, the total collection of Sufi practices. And then you get 3 further ones, kasab, shagal, amal, which, despite their Persian names, in fact are in the Indian yoga practices, and they are in particular for more special achievements, some specialization in a certain direction. So first you get these 4 sets of practices which really are the actual content of Sufi training, and then you have the further 3 for those people who would have some particular concept being a special breathing practice, shagal being a kind of interiorization, very important. Nathan himself considers it a very important aspect, going inwards, throwing one's faculties inwards, and then of course amal is the final stage, which in yoga is known as samadhi. So these are very specialized practices, of course, but they still belong to those 7 which make up the Sufi set of practices. So that's one entry into Sufi esotericism, entry into that which a murid can observe to the extent he feels impelled to do so, inspired to do so. So that's this other aspect is what we would call the ethical aspect, and there one can distinguish, as far as I've been able to make out, three different ones. I must say that this ethical aspect has been very important from the very beginning of Moshe's teaching. When we look to the organization of the Sufi world as it was in England in the First World War days, then you see that there were various types of classes and practices for different degrees of murids, but that moral culture was something which everybody caring to attend a Sufi meeting was welcome to. You did not need to be a murid, you just could attend these lectures on moral culture as a first stage, a first reconnaissance into the Sufi world. So, obviously, they were quite important, and many of you doubtless know them in the first place from the book Moral Culture. Moral Culture is a typical book of lessons, really, of articulating one's various stages of one's moral consciousness and practice. Now, in addition to that moral culture, you have, and you find that in volume 1 of the collected works of the so-called yellow edition, or the Pallant edition of the 1960s, reprinted in the 1990s, you'll find different courses, what Moshe calls Iman, and by Iman he means the kind of belief which develops into faith, which develops into conviction, which develops into something which becomes part of your own being. That's no longer something which you cultivate, which you have implanted in your being, and, so to speak, practice that in every different direction. So, of this Iman, as Moshe says, there are 4 stages, and I'll briefly read it with a technical text, but I think it gives some clarity to be able to distinguish them. First, he says, there is a very general form of Iman, Iman al-Mu'min. That is what he calls, Moshe calls, an insecure belief. The kind of thing you tend to believe because, you know, your surroundings believe it, you assume that there is something, you think something is there, but the circumstances and the conditions in which you are really determined what that belief continues to be. So, after that first stage of insecure belief, as Moshe calls it, the second stage, Imani Kamil, is an idealistic faith, a faith born out of idealism. And Moshe calls it Imani Kamil, that means the one in process of being completed. It's not yet a complete belief, but it is a belief which is being completed. And it may, of course, sometimes be very bright, but there is always a risk that it is a kind of start wavering, or it may be dimmed by reason. That is that second stage of development. It is a kind of a weighing between that idealist faith, and yet the reason we may still cast its shadow upon it. But then you get to the third stage of this faith. It's no longer a belief, it is by that time faith, it is conviction, that is the kind of haq al-iman, the truth of faith, by which reason supports what you believe. Reason supports your belief, and so that is immensely strengthened by the fact that both your idealism and your reason are in conjunction, supply that element of understanding and of awareness in yourself. And then finally, you get Ayn al-Iman, that means the essence of belief, and that essence of belief is really conviction, is something which you have appropriated into yourself, and so to speak, you no longer conscious focus on it, because it has become part of your mental makeup and of your spiritual awareness. So these are these 4 stages of belief. As I said, you find them in volume 1 of the collected works. And that is something which, of course, one can, of course, study with one another, discuss with one another, but also very much something which everyone can develop in himself. Being aware, you have something and you are not quite sure of what you doubt, and you still wonder how you can justify all that. Regard that as natural. Regard as natural that belief has not yet come to faith. That faith itself has to turn into conviction. That there's a process of growth. And growth, of course, is always gradual. It's not a thing that happens from one day to another. Growth, the more stable, the more mature growth becomes, it is something which is developed through time. So that's something that all of us can really, in that way, appropriate to oneself. So as I said, you have the disciplinary aspect of the practices, then you have this psychological process which Inayat calls the seer's way, the weg van de ziener, the seer's way through these different categories which ripen you into conviction. But what we should also add to this, also these are tools which you use. Your belief, your faith, your belief, your faith, your conviction also are tools for something you have to appropriate in yourself. Don't keep hanging on the tools. So then you get a very typical Sufi concept, which is tark, which is abandonment. Abandon the one category for the other. As you climb to a third one, you kind of ripen to a third one, abandon the first. And so Inayat sums that up very characteristically in his style, in this case very classical Sufi style. So he says, first abandoning of the worldly ideal, abandonment of the heavenly ideal, abandoning of the divine ideal, and then even abandoning of the abandonment. Het opgeven van het opgeven. Het verlaten van het verlaten. In other words, don't be bound to things. Things are tools. These matters are tools. For the one to enter to the other, or at leave off the other one. And then from one to another until you really appropriated it. And then, of course, abandon that idea of abandoning. Because it has become part of your own being, part of your own self, integrated into being as you needed it. So that, as I said, you find in the first volume of Mahmood's work. Now in the very well-known book in an Eastern Rose Garden, in een Oosterse rozentuin, veel van u kennen dat boek, vindt u nog een verdere, hele traditionele, maar niettemin ook weer in Mahmood's woorden heel zinvolle categorie. In the Rose Garden you find that very early but very characteristic category, where he says these 4 traditional stages of Shariat. And Shariat, don't think of anything like law or things like that, in which context it is also used. He said Shariat is the morals. You first learn the morals, as in moral culture. First learn a moral attitude to life. And what to Murshid is a moral attitude to life, and you all of you must have come across that in Murshid's work, and with friendliness. So friendliness is the attitude not only to your friends, which is normal, also to acquaintances, also to people you might not know, even to your enemies. Yeah, a typical Persian expression that is for that, but friendship, practice friendship towards everybody, also those people with whom you are in a negative relationship, also with people you regard as adversary, also indeed to your enemies, to the extent possible, practice friendship in all relationships. So, of course, that's not a sentimental thing, that's a point of mastery. As long as it's sentimental, it has no value. But it's a mastery which you achieve, because in that way you always remain above that which you have to cope with. That's mastery. And so that's where you. So again, that's another aspect of this stage of ethics. And finally, there is one which again contains a number of these Indian technical, of rather Persian technical terms, which are still. You see, that is the tackling of the ego. All of you, of course, know these different texts about the training of the ego in the Gathas and the Gitas, where they are very, very typically articulated in a very systematic way, and I know that all of you know them. But then, you know, the ego, in the famous, in every type of Sufism, the word for ego is well known that it's nafs. Nafs means, well, niks te maken met het ouderwetse Nederlandse nuffig. Ik bedoel nuffig. Nou, inmiddels geloof ik niet meer zo'n courant als dat zo'n vroeger was, om begrijpelijke redenen. Maar niet meer. Nafs, dus in de zin van eigenheid. Dat betekent echt een soort eigenheid waarmee je jezelf aanhangt. Nafs is the kind of yourself in which you maintain yourself. And then he says there is a stage, 5 stages of this nafs in which you kind of develop it, expand it, and conquer it. So he said the first type of nafs is the nafs ammara, which is the lowest stage of the ego, in which the ego acts under the influence of its senses. Dus het ego beheerst dus een zintuigen. And so that's the very first stage. And then beyond that second, then you get the second, I only go through very briefly, of course I can't take time to discuss all these things very elaborately. I just wanted to sum up what was said yesterday. The second stage is nafs al-lawwama, and that Moshe defines, but he has these kind of very pithy definitions of this concept. So he says nafs al-lawwama is greed controlled by intelligence. Begeerigheid beheerst door intelligentie. Dan gaan we eraan staan. Heel goede oefening. Greed controlled by intelligence. Dan de volgende derde stadium is nafs mutma'inna. En mutma'inna vertaalt Moshe dan als benevolence. Mutma'inna, benevolence, goodwill. Controlled by goodwill. And that means that one's impulses are controlled by one's spirit. Now, of course, this is a very important acquisition. One's impulses, one's emotions, one's kind of vehemence is controlled by one's spirit. That's really a stage in which one has advanced quite noticeably. And once one has that in control, there are 2 further stages which really signify the fulfillment of this control of selfhood, of external selfhood. The first one is then the 4th stage of nafs alima, which means the stage of wisdom, of understanding, of getting things right, of kind of justifying one's behavior and controlling one's speech and one's actions and one's thoughts. Thought, speech, and action controlled by this wisdom, by this sense of maturing understanding. And that then leads to the fulfillment of the control of selfhood, of external selfhood. That is nafs salima. That means the peaceful, and we might say the serene type of being. That nafs which acquires serenity, which is serene, And that means that one is fully devoted to the openness of one's being. And openness of one's being, in fact, means being open to divine reality, to admit that element of divine being into one's consciousness of one's being. And that, by that awareness of that openness by which one communicates with that kind of divinity in the depths of your own soul, that also causes that one is ready to sacrifice for another, to sacrifice to one's fellow man, to devote oneself to the divine impulse of one's inner being, and that again occasions one to commit oneself to the well-being of one's fellow man. That's that principle of development. Now, these different categories which I mentioned, you will find the first four developments, from Nafsa Ammara till Nafsa Alima, you will find in the Collected Works, volume 12. There you have a wonderful chapter on the development of personality, and especially the later one, the fourth one, you will find in volume 11, where you get the realization of the true ego, the realization of the true ego. Again, a wonderful chapter which moves deep for the fulfillment of that self-awareness which the human being has to develop to come into these further stages of understanding and of insight in life. So these are the different categories which I mentioned in what I call the ethical aspect of Moshe's work. And then, of course, there's another one which all of you have become very familiar with. That is, of course, the aesthetic one. And so, in other words, the absorption in beauty. And that, of course, in a way seems it is, of course, an extremely attractive one. But again, that's not meant, never forget that, these things are not meant in any kind of sentimental way. They are meant in the way of mastery. In other words, there's many different ways to enjoy beauty, to like beauty, but to focus on beauty and to absorb beauty, that's a very different matter. And so, that is precisely what you try to do in that whole course of meditation, in the four stages of meditation, which you all know. That is concentration, contemplation, meditation, and realization. There again, you have another of these categories which play a role in Sufism. And so, that is that idea of focusing on beauty is very essential. Now, there are very different ways of focusing on beauty. For instance, in one of the great chapters in the Unity of Religious Ideals, the final chapter of the first part of the Unity, there you find first, after having mastered the psychological aspect of prayer, which Bush discusses, why these different categories of prayer, one needs to adore, one's need for adoration of something which one feels to be higher than oneself, of what would be lifted out of one's sense of inadequacy, and of course in provision of one's needs. After those psychological categories of prayer, what does Bush say? What's the further stage of what he calls prayer? That is the awareness of divine presence in the beauty of nature. This in itself is quite a remarkable concept, of course, because on the one hand, as we know nature, there's quite a bit of violence and quite a bit, of rivalry with trees and animals and whatever. There's quite a lot of trouble, to say nothing of all the mud and the problems which you get in nature. And nonetheless, All of us, when we go on holiday, there was nothing we like better than going to nature, isn't it? There's nothing more which idealize of the possibility of going out and enjoy nature. So, exactly. So that is it. These two aspects. Yes, exactly. These two aspects are there. And the wonderful thing is that you rise above all the division and dirt and threats and problems which nature also involves to enjoy its beauty. You go into here, the seaside, you go into the woodlands, you go into the dunes, you go into the mountains, and there nature is full of that kind of life serenity, which Immersion gives also a wonderful depiction of. Again, in the Rose Garden, you find that chapter, Silent Life, where Bush describes the communion of the soul of the human being with the surrounding serenity of nature. And Bush again speaks of his own experience, because as a very young man he was in Nepal, later on also in Europe, and beauty spots, he always had that sense of upliftment which the beauty of nature can give. But then in addition to nature, there was so much beauty, for instance, in art. Of course, that's precisely in art, but also in science. Moshe also emphasizes that even science ultimately is not a process started in the intellect, but in intuition. Why do you choose a particular subject, a particular theme, a particular line of studies? There's something in yourself which draws you to it. That's why you choose it. That element of personal taste, that subjective taste, which later leads you to your intellect and an objective discipline, but still starts in that intuitive personal taste. So for Moshe, that is again the heart, and ultimately therefore the soul, which feeds the heart, which determines that which you achieve even in the form of intellect. And as you know, many mathematicians and great experts will speak of the beauty of mathematics. I've now been able to understand the slightest mathematics, and often tell me ugly. But anyway, great mathematicians will emphasize the beauty of mathematics, the beauty of physics, the beauty of all these kind of material things in which you have become expert. And then, of course, speaking of art, and that there become, of course, the most particular specialism. How art proceeds from the visual arts to the conceptual arts, like literature and poetry and everything which even goes beyond the depicting, the pictorial arts, which themselves you can focus on. Then you get intellectual arts, let us say, and ultimately you get what for Moshe is the greatest of all arts, is of course music. And music in many different ways, Moshe emphasizes that it is precisely the tone of music, the sound, the tone, the beauty of music, because it is no longer bound to any kind of form, which, you know, completes that kind of sense of aesthetic focus, that the experience of beauty, which is so much focused, so one is so much lifted into that contemplation of beauty, that it leads one very easily into the experience of meditation. Once you have been able to absorb beauty, then the absorption in meditation is very near and very easy. Now, for Untitled, as I said, it was above all music, but you could say that every art in which you are able to absorb, or every art which absorbs you, can have that same effect. But sometimes it is said that the Dutch, here in Holland, are very specialized in the pictorial arts, in particular in painting. And that even observing a painting which you enjoy as of great beauty may have that same effect. There is a story of a French, fairly recent, well-known French writer, who became one of the great French authors, of whom it is said he used to come to Holland every year and stay at The Hague, and in the Mauritshuis he would go and look at the gezicht of Delft, the famous picture of Delft there. And he would sit there, just contemplate this picture, and then again, after having finished his business in Holland, he would then return to France, but that was an annual thing which he strove forever to return to the contemplation of this picture. That's contemplative power. That's really contemplative. So even from any art which really appeals you so much that it fully takes you in, or you are fully taken in by it, will result in that particular atmosphere, and which again enables very easily, as I said, we have the disciplinary aspect of the practices, the kind of yoga method, then we have the ethical methods, and then you had that aspect through beauty. And that's in a sense the most immediate one, the most direct one, and of course in many ways the most enjoyable one. So that's one thing which I've been cultivating here. We have been able to enjoy very different sounds of music from this, from the single tone of the metal, which we heard yesterday, and our fellow Ragni produced that wonderful music this morning. I think it was also there, and then we had, of course, our Turkish fellow Murids who have this wonderful meditative music. So in every way, absorption into the beauty of sound, because you get music, you get tone, you get sound, and you get vibration. And there you have exactly that progression from in the perception of what you seek to experience. So here we are in this way. I think every one of you who attended yesterday night would have felt something of that experience, how beauty touches one's innermost being and seeks to absorb that, to live that. So, living towards one's soul and within one's soul and as from one's soul is, of course, one condition of being, in the same way that one's physical existence is a condition of being. And one thing which is good remembering is that, of course, in our everyday life, at a particular moment, one aspect of our being is bound to dominate. Now, normally speaking, none of us can avoid that, and what's more, none of us would care to avoid it, is that one is, of course, conscious of one's physical being. Especially when you do something of physical exertion. You are eating or drinking, or you are running, or you are doing something which is athletic, whatever, everything involves your physical being. Now, that does not mean that your mind and your heart and your soul are not also involved in that physical activity, but at that moment, your physical activity will dominate. But then you get another stage. You may, for instance, be focused on something which is very interesting to you. And there we can take the example of almost every child, which has that faculty and which loses it when it grows up. Being fully focused on what you play with. For us, being fully focused on, for instance, you read a wonderful poem, some splendid literature, or something which you really fully live into. Now, what happens? Then you really, it is your mind which dominates. You are reading something, or maybe you're listening to a broadcast, a television, whatever. If you are focused on that, you might not notice that somebody passes by you. Somebody tells you something and you don't hear it. Even if you hear it, you don't really listen to it. There is something which, at that moment, your mind dominates. Your mind dominates over your body, and again, it's not that the heart and the soul are not involved in the totality of your being, but at that moment, the mind has that chance, has given that chance, needs that chance. Give it a chance. Needs that chance to be dominating in your being. And the same thing with your heart. If your heart is deeply moved by whatever it be, by beauty, by love, by any kind of aspect, your heart is fully engages yourself, then even what you think becomes important, even what your mind produces becomes important. As far as your body, you just don't care, because it is your heart which dominates. And so there again, that need is there, it's given. And then there may be these moments, these three aspects, all of them everybody can practice. No, mostly it happens quite automatically. People they don't take notice of it, but it is spontaneous up and down between these three faculties which is present in everybody. But then that fourth faculty of the soul is always present, never perceived. And the search for the perception of that soul, which after all animates everything, because it is the impulse of life in the human being. That's called mysticism. That's why we go from contemplative philosophy, like in the ethical aspect of mysticism, and give the soul the chance to dominate in its own turn. So there are these different faculties in the human being, allow all of them at a particular moment of your life to dominate over all the others. All the others will be there, but let one be dominant. That is, of course, which we try, as far as the soul is concerned, the dimension of the soul, to develop that in our Sufi life, in our Sufi practices, in our awareness of the inner reality of being. So that is so that's one aspect which very much pertained to the practice which we will be doing this afternoon, and which is the wazifa. As I mentioned to you, and you all of course know that perfectly well, the wazifa is the second practice which you take on. And the first practice being the namaz, the second practice being the wazifa, third practice being the zikr, as we hope to look tonight. And as I said yesterday, maybe I might recall that again, in the first stage, what's the sense of namaz? That is where, since Sufism is a theist form of discipline, like all the Western religions, from Zoroaster, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Manichaeism, all these were monotheistic or are monotheistic religions, and part of the Hindu tradition is also theistic, but also Hinduism has a particular aspect which is not atheistic, mind you, not at all, but non-theistic, like Buddhism. So you have these different forms, and so in between these forms, our Sufism is a typical Indian theistic method of meditative fulfillment. And so there you get that the first aspect is namaz, where that awareness of divine being is given an anthropomorphic shape. That is the God of religion. The God of religion which you focus on as on a person. You see God as that person, or at least you associate God with a personal aspect. Now, if we think about our relations of human beings amongst one another, how we perceive our fellow man is also very different. We start with focusing, necessarily when we meet somebody, we focus on the physical aspect of that person. We see a person before us. We shake hands, or if we are good Sufis, we do namaskar. I hope that will be one thing which we Sufis will continue. I find it such a beautiful exercise from India and Indonesia where they have this. But anyway, you first shake hands or whatever you do, you meet that person physically. But then, whether your contact, your friendship, your appreciation of that person continues, depends first maybe on the quality of mind. And you say, well, I like this person because he thinks in such a way, he speaks in such a way, his own mental makeup is such that he or she appeals to me. And so I have that contact with that person. So that the contact, there's the dominant contact is that of the mind. Now you get further, you see somebody who you might not communicate so easily intellectually, mentally, but you might have a contact with the heart. That's such a nice person, such a warm-hearted person, such a cordial person. Very often that goes even beyond the intellectual appreciation of a person, goes to that quality of the heart, to that warmth of heart, to that inner being which radiates out and moves you in a way and which gives you a deeper sense of contact with the person. Finally, you might find somebody who you say, well, I don't know what the kind of a person it is, and very often these are dervishes and such people, well, what a kind of shabby person this is and what is that. But the radiance of that person, you perceive his soul. That again is the first. So again, in your appreciation of another human being, that we pass through these 4 forms of appreciation. Now, if we deal with divine reality, it's exactly the same. We start with an image of divine reality, a very personalized image, a very simply the God in a very anthropomorphic shape. That is our namaz. And if you have the system you follow this, it's simply important that you follow these stages. That in every stage of your consciousness, you attach to that element of divine reality which corresponds to your own situation at a particular time. So, after that stage of namaz, which kind of settles in you that image of a theistic reality also in the form of personal Godhead, then the next stage is the vazifa. And there you pass beyond the concept of divine reality in, let us say, an anthropomorphic form. A form is a kind of your human being is really very superior, but still conceived in human terms, in terms of of what we know of our human beings, but then, of course, in a perfect way. But then the next stage is no longer you focus on the form of the Godhead, but on the inner attributes of the Godhead. His attributes, his sifatullah, the characteristics of divine being. So that's exactly the same as with a human being. You say, well, never mind what he looks like, but his mind is so brilliant and his heart is so warm, and so we have these values that we appreciate in him. See, and that is exactly the thing you want with vazifas as well. For vazifas, it is not that you include them into an anthropomorphic element. You pass by the anthropomorphic element of your namaz stage into the perception of these attributes, beyond the outer form of an anthropomorphic form, into the character, again, these attributes which we recite are still derived from our human awareness, as God in the form of a great personality is derived from the form of our awareness of our physical being. And so the vazifas are still human awareness of our human characteristics, but seen against the background of a divine reality, which informs it, which gives it life, which is the real reality of that which we repeat. In a way, you could regard these sifatillah, these vazifas, as, let us say, a kind of radio or a kind of television. You establish that into yourself in order that you gather from that unseen reality which is somewhere, radio waves, television pictures, whatever. But you get them in that apparatus you've got there in your own room. So in the same way you have in your own mind, you have a certain facility, you have a certain picture. It is a picture which you evoke yourself, but through it you seek to achieve that unseen reality in that particular shape, which is that which you can comprehend, which you can understand, because these are attributes which have a certain familiarity for you. Then, of course, to anticipate in the evening, but you all know that, of course. This third stage is that of the zikr, and there you are no longer a question of attributes to which you seek to focus upon the unseen reality. You should focus on that unseen reality itself, upon the Zati Ilahi. After the Sifat Ilahi, that means the attributes, the divine attributes, you focus on the divine essence. That's the idea of zikr. And then the fourth stage, which we get tonight, after having observed that zikr practice, you get the fourth of the four which I mentioned to you before, which is repeating in a particular way. Maybe we can practice that with zikr a little later, if we have time. You place into the breath, because doing an exercise, the exercise we do is like, well, in an old-fashioned expression, winding the clock. It is an expression which in Buddhist Islam is so perfectly valid. And so winding that clock, but why do you wind that clock? In order that it will work for a certain time. And so, really speaking, when you do these vasifas, and particularly when you do your vasifas at home and you're busy with these practices in your own context, remember that at least as much time as you devote to a particular practice, take at least as much time at just having a silence after it. Because that's when it has to come to life, that is when it has to show its results. It's not that, these vasifas are not a kind of magical formula that you say, well, now it's there. Well, no. It is something which helps your being to be attuned in a particular depth of perception and try to, through the silence following the practice, try to hold out something of that awareness which that attribute has created in you. Well, so these, of course, by now you must be really exhausted by all these words which so I better hurry to shut up. But anyway, this is in großen Ganzen something which is applicable to these different practices. Now what I would propose to you, that we do a vasifa, which is a very elementary one, a very widespread one, but which still has a focus quite of its own, because it includes these two divine characteristics of transcendence and immanence. And that is in the nominative form we call Rahman and Rahim. Now, Rahman means, it has many meanings, but in our context it means the transcendent one, the one who is absolute being, as a transcendent reality. And then Rahim is precisely that inner reality, the immanence of God. So in this one vasifah, Ya Rahman Rahim, Ya is of course the vocative form, that Ya Rahman Rahim, that means you, in one meditative phrase, you include both the transcendent and the immanent aspects of mystical awareness, of the search of divine reality. So, shall we try that? Shall we try put it together? Jullie toon in, Mehmet? Mehmet, bitte geben Sie den Ton mit, Mehmet und Ali. Und Sie haben die Töne gut klingen lassen. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ya Rahmanirrahim. Ya Rahmanirrahim. Ya Rahmanirrahim. Ya Rahmanirrahim. Ya Rahmanirrahim. Ya Ya under the fourth stage of this Sufi practice. There's this fikr. Repeat on the breath, on the natural breath. Don't force the breath, but on your natural breath, try to repeat this Rahman Rahim, Rahman Rahim, Rahman Rahim, without Ya, just Rahman Rahim, Rahman Rahim, or according to the rhythm of your breath, Rahman Rahim, Rahman Rahim. Both of these are valid. Please try to observe that for a while, repeating on the breath these words, and in time allow these words to evaporate and keep the silence at the level of attunement which you have reached. If you feel that you have reached a certain level of attunement which you would like to hold, then you can let go the words of the fikr, of the wazifa you're doing, and just keep silence at that level of attunement which you have achieved. Rahman Rahim, or Rahman Rahim, according to your rhythm of breath. Praise be to Thee, most supreme God, omnipotent, omnipresent, all-pervading, the only being. Take us in Thy parental arms, raise us from the denseness of the earth, pour upon us Thy love and Thy light, give sustenance to our bodies, hearts and souls, use us for the purpose that Thy wisdom chooseth, and guide us on the path of Thine own goodness. Draw us closer to Thee every moment of our lives, until in us be reflected Thy grace, Thy glory, Thy wisdom, Thy joy,